Pat is a writer, organizer, and social entrepreneur who tells stories to advance causes, organizations, and businesses. He's the Vancouver founder of Upstanders Canada, which was created to mobilize non-Jewish Canadians to stand up against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. He's written for the Jewish Independent newspaper for 25 years and is on their editorial board. Pat was religion and spirituality columnist for the Vancouver Courier and has been published in scores of media outlets, including the Globe and Mail and the National Post. He's worked with Hillel, Canadian Jewish Congress, the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center, and many other Jewish and Zionist organizations. Pat has devoted years of service and is a friend and ally to the Jewish people. I was thinking this morning that if I were to look up the word mensch in the Yiddish dictionary, that Pat would probably show up as an example. He is very honorable and has tremendous integrity. A bit of housekeeping, please save your questions to the end. If you like what we do at the Men's Club, please consider becoming a member, or if you are a member, please renew your membership. So welcome, Pat, for your second talk to the Men's Club.
Thank you, David. Yes, this is my second talk to the Men's Club, but previously it was on Zoom. So this is really weird for me to be up here. I'm usually out there. I've been out there a lot, but this is my first time up here. I feel like I should be like doing my Haftorah or something. So I am honored to speak with you. I will just, well, actually, I was going to give you a quick overview of where I come from, but David really did that. So thankfully, we can save a second there. I founded Upstanders Canada, which aims to mobilize primarily non-Jewish Canadians to stand against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. To be clear, we're not saying they are the same thing, but we are saying both of them are bad. And to be clear again, anti-Zionism is not criticism of Israel. Anti-Zionism is opposition to the existence of a Jewish state. There is often a lot of sloppiness around this language, and we should be precise. Anytime we discuss anti-Semitism today, we risk being sidetracked by discussion about whether or how anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I believe this is often used as a weapon to derail the discussion. Put simply, ideas about Jewish people play a role in ideas about the Jewish state. Of course they do, and it's ridiculous to say otherwise. But it is complicated. We could spend an hour on that intersection alone. We will discuss ways to address this factor without allowing it to circumvent the larger issue. But we do ourselves no favors by pretending the two are utterly unrelated, which a group of people in this sanctuary did last year during the first candidates forum of the municipal election, when now Mayor Ken Sim promised that under his guidance, the city would adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and a bunch of people stood up to protest, and Rabbi Dan made short work of them. Two things I want to make really clear. You're members of a Jewish congregation, most of you anyway, so you're not Upstanders' target market, but I will focus on aspects that I think are especially relevant to Jewish audiences. Second, and most importantly, you don't need non-Jewish people coming in here explaining anti-Semitism to you. That, in fact, has been part of the problem around this subject in recent years. People arrogating the definition of anti-Semitism and telling Jewish people effectively whether or not their experiences are valid. With those two caveats in mind, I hope you'll find the discussion informative, useful, and not too dispiriting. I will just warn you, obviously when we're talking about the subject, it's not always pleasant. I won't go into a whole lot of examples because I don't think anybody really needs the evidence. I don't think anybody in this crowd does. As a society, As a society, North Americans are engaged right now, however imperfectly, in a deep dialogue about race. In the context of this dialogue, it is accepted that the responsibility and the right to define experiences with discrimination fall to the members of the affected group. The only exception to this rule is Jews. Repeatedly in today's dialogue on race, we see Jewish people treated differently than every other group, even by people who self-define as anti-racist. And I argue that this is proof itself of a problem. IRA is the starkest example. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, underwent an intensive multi-year process to create what has been accepted around the world as one of the most thorough, effective definitions of anti-Semitism yet. And yet, everywhere it is considered for adoption, it has met opposition. In the next day or so, you'll get an email via David with some resources, including an essay that I published recently in The Independent on this subject. So we won't go too deep into the weeds on this now. But the criticism is mostly around the intersection, not surprise, of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Some of those criticisms may be fair, but whatever legitimate criticisms can be made of the IRA definition, it does represent, I think, the only example of a group's thoughtfully considered self-definition of prejudice being not just challenged, but rejected by large groups of people. One of the core problems we face today is that some people are willing to devote more resources to fighting over the definition of anti-Semitism than they are to fighting anti-Semitism. Now, it may be fair that we have a more contentious discussion around anti-Semitism than we do around other forms of racism, because anti-Semitism is different from other forms of bigotry and discrimination. It is different in part because Jewish people are different. Jews do not fit into the convenient racial boxes that we like to place people. This is especially true in the discourse around race that has emerged in the last decade or two, in which the white, non-white binary is the fundamental underpinning of our understanding. I do just want to take a moment to discuss what I think is a problem with the very term anti-Semitism. The prefix anti implies active, conscious attitudes or behaviors. This makes sense since it was invented 150 years ago by a proud anti-Semite to describe his ideology. And understandably, that conscious antipathy applies to people who are marching with tiki torches through Charlottesville, chanting anti-Semitic slogans. But that type of anti-Semite is the most easily confronted. These are dangerous people and ideas. I'm not dismissing that. But there is a universal consensus on this among people of goodwill. All decent people condemn that. There are not, as someone once said, good people on both sides. But the longer-term anti-Semitic challenge that concerns me most is far more nuanced and less overt. We are dealing overwhelmingly with unconscious biases. People do not even realize they carry them. So when we call someone out for a statement that appears to us to be premised on anti-Semitic stereotypes, it doesn't resonate. People say, I don't hate Jews, so how can you call me an anti-Semite? So that's a fundamental challenge, and we'll come back to the issue of conscious versus unconscious biases. But to help understand where I come from, I'll just share three of many books, but three books that have had a significant impact on my thinking. Anti-Judaism by David Nuremberg argues that to construct a cohesive Western civilization, it was necessary to position early Christian Europe against what had come before. And theologically, that was Judaism. Therefore, Western civilization is founded on fundamentally anti-Jewish premises. It suggests that negative ideas about Jews are in the DNA of our entire culture. Anti-Semitism, or anti-Judaism as Nuremberg differentiates it, in other words, is not a bug of Western civilization, but a feature. Dr. Theodore Isaac Rubin takes a micro rather than a macro approach to the problem. He argues that anti-Semitism is, in effect, a mental illness, that it is a social contagion that certain people are particularly susceptible to. And then there are bookshelves filled with other theories. One of the most important approaches to fighting it, and one of the ways that we have failed to do, I think, is to balance that theoretical approach by educating ourselves and others about the diverse historical ways that anti-Semitism has manifested. So a third book that is extraordinary for this purpose is The Anguish of the Jews, written by Edward Flannery, a Catholic priest, during the liberalizing ferment of the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s. Flannery produced what was and may remain one of the most compendious litanies of European anti-Semitism. This history is key, I believe, because anti-Semitism morphs constantly. So we almost have to immerse ourselves in the many mutations of centuries of anti-Semitism to see the myriad forms it has taken in the past so that we can see the parallels that are happening today. But critically, the inevitable question, why the Jews? Dennis Prager and Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, in a 1983 book, addressed this subject. I've encountered, among a lot of people, especially young people first encountering anti-Semitism, the idea that if a hatred has been going on for thousands of years, there has to be something to it. So here is a point we really need to be clear on. Anti-Semitism is a problem that affects Jews, but it is not a problem of Jews. In a weird way, anti-Semitism has nothing to do with Jews, except that Jews are the collateral damage in a corrupt world poisoned by anti-Semitic ideas. The Jews in the anti-Semitic imagination are not actual Jewish people. They are a caricature, a scapegoat, an invention of the anti-Semitic mind. If the Jews did not exist, anti-Semites would have had to invent them. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. But the question remains, why the Jews? And Prager and Telushkin explain that as effectively as possible. There are reasons, theological reasons, social reasons. The Jews were often the only other in many of the societies where they lived. There is pure spite and envy, the latter of which I think deserves at least a whole hour to itself. There are many reasons. But the question turns the problem around on its victims. Instead of asking why the anti-Semites, we ask why the Jews. And we imply through this formulation that there must be something about these people that brings millennia of hatred down upon them. This is an example of one of the tentpoles of anti-Semitism, victim blaming. As a journalist, I was once obligated to call a renovation company to ask why one of their employees on a work site was wearing a t-shirt with a swastika on it, which understandably upset a Jewish resident in the building. When I reached the company, the person on the phone demanded, "So do we all have to do whatever the Jews want now?" Suddenly, the neo-Nazi was not a perpetrator of hatred and racism, but a victim of a vast conspiracy based on Jewish power. The motif of Jewish power, which is just a single example of a complex of stereotypes, tropes, and biases undergirding anti-Semitism in the Western world, allows the perpetrator to play the victim and the victim to be cast as perpetrator. Victim blaming exists in other bigotries, but the idea that Jews bring it on themselves is a fundamental bedrock of anti-Semitism. This is the basis of both Christian and Muslim theological anti-Semitism. If the Jews would just accept the successor religion, we wouldn't have to pogrom them. Medieval anti-Semitism portrayed Jews as having mystical powers. Today, that power is portrayed as political, economic, of controlling the media and Hollywood and so forth. Ideas of Jewish power negate legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism, and that formulation has essentially been the Teflon that has helped prevent anti-Semitism from being defeated. Every time we call out anti-Semitism, the perpetrators paint themselves as victims of powerful Jews, and the stereotypes are reinforced. That's why I call anti-Semitism the perfect prejudice. We will get nowhere if we do not confront and neutralize this tentpole of prejudice. The Jewish power motif is the source for a related idea, that Jewish people have a persecution complex. If you believe that a group of people is uniquely powerful, and then you hear these same people complain about being victimized, logically, you assume they're crying wolf. The trope of a Jewish persecution complex doubles down on the victimization. Not only do they experience discrimination, if they mention it, they're accused of a socio-psychological disorder. Even empirical evidence in the form of hate crime statistics are called into question. I have heard it said multiple times recently that anti-Semitic hate crime statistics may be overblown because Jews are the kinds of people who pick up the phone to report these sorts of crimes. In other words, we can ignore Jewish expressions about anti-Semitism because, excuse me for illustrating this so crudely, those people are always complaining. Again, that's why I call it the perfect prejudice. Even empirical proof of discrimination is discredited as evidence of a Jewish pathology. Proof of anti-Semitism is dismissed through a formulation that rests on anti-Semitic suppositions. It's perfect. It's the perfect prejudice. Adjacent to the persecution complex allegation, there's a prevalent meme in our society that Jewish people place their suffering above that of others, of making the world into a permanent competition of victimhood. In a direct abrogation of Santayana's dictum that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, we invert this idea and insist that remembering Jewish history is a weapon for eclipsing everyone else's, that Jews claim to be the only people who have suffered. In fact, precisely the opposite is the case. Jewish history, suffering, and victimhood are diminished and dismissed in ways no other people's experiences are. Of course, Jewish people are not the only ones who have suffered. They are, however, the only group in our empathetic, multicultural society being told to shut up about it. Here's a key to understanding the problem. Jewish power, persecution complexes, myths of competitive victimology, and most other expressions of anti-Semitism are forms of conspiracy theories. A pivotal moment in the intersection of anti-Semitism and conspiracism came in the early 20th century with the fabrication of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which is still shopped around in many places as fact. Notably, it is explicitly referenced in the 1988 Hamas Charter as if it were a real thing. And it has gone through many reprints across the Muslim world in far-right fringes and elsewhere. When it was invented in Russia around 1901, it was not so much a new work as a greatest hits album of centuries of anti-Semitic and other conspiracies. The document purports to be the minutes of a secret meeting held in a graveyard at midnight by Jews intent on taking over the world. Henry Ford saturated the United States with a version of the protocols via his newspaper and through Ford dealerships across the country. More recently, about 20 years ago, a 44-episode TV series purporting to tell the history of the modern Middle East was produced by Egyptian television and played across the Arab world during Ramadan. In fact, it was essentially a weeks-long dramatization based on the protocols, and so hundreds of millions of people would break the Ramadan fast and then settle in night after night for 44 days to watch a series of the most appalling anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. If anti-Semitism is almost always a conspiracy theory, the opposite is also true. Conspiracy theories are almost always anti-Semitic. Let a conspiracy theory ferment long enough, and it doesn't usually take long, and it will eventually get around to blaming Jews. There's no reason why someone can't have crazy ideas about any subject and construct a ludicrous theory about hidden figures and secretive puppet masters influencing events and leave it at that. But they almost never do. Case in point. The so-called Unite the Right white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 was when most people first encountered the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. This is the idea that there is a Jewish conspiracy to open American borders to non-white immigrants in order to undermine the white race and create a majority non-white society. But why the Jews? There's that question again in a different context. Why can't you be opposed to non-white immigration and leave it at that? Why drag the Jews into this? The answer, if there is one, is simply that, as I said, almost every conspiracy theory eventually turns to the Jews. Anti-Semitism is almost always a conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories are almost always anti-Semitic. There's something else afoot. Last February, there were 2 shootings near a synagogue in Los Angeles, not fatal, thankfully. On a Wednesday and Thursday, separate shootings took place, targeting individuals leaving the synagogue. Police initially said that these were unrelated incidents. They suggested the first shooting was not a hate-motivated crime at all. On the Friday, when they arrested a suspect, it turned out that the incidents were not unrelated, and the individual had a long history of horribly violent anti-Semitic comments on social media. So why the original disclaimers? In 2019, there was a shooting at a kosher grocery store in Jersey City. 4 people were murdered, 3 were injured, and the 2 assailants were also killed. Police insisted this was not an anti-Semitic crime until they were confronted with the evidence that the place was targeted because it was Jewish. Again, why the upfront denial before the facts were in? This happens, I would say, more times than not when an anti-Jewish hate crime occurs. Probably the most famous example was after the 2015 terror attacks in Paris, when then US President Barack Obama offhandedly referred to terrorists who, quote, randomly shoot a bunch of folks in a deli. It was, of course, anything but random. There's no point in jumping to conclusions about motives when an investigation is in its early stages. But if officials are going to do that anyway, why err on the side of randomness? There is a fundamental refusal to see anti-Semitism even at its most violent and obvious. Perhaps it's wishful thinking. We hope it's not anti-Semitism. But rose-tinted glasses are not what we need right now. Here's an explanation. Excuse me. We measure discrimination in large part by economic outcomes. Women and people of color experience discrimination that can be measured by fewer opportunities, unequal incomes, lower household wealth. That is not, in North America, how anti-Semitism manifests. So if we can't measure anti-Semitism by this method, which is a Marxian measuring stick, which I'll come back to in a minute, does this mean it simply doesn't exist? Now we have to address a fact here, that much of the problem we see today comes from the left. And I want to make clear, I'm on the left. I do not have a right-wing axe to grind. These are my people, and I've seen it up close. But this requires some context. Deborah Lipstadt, the United States Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism, made an important distinction between far-left and far-right anti-Semitism. She said, quote, right now, the much stronger manifestation of physical danger, my emphasis, physical danger, comes from extremist right-wing, white supremacist, white nationalist groups. The guards in front of synagogues, and there's no synagogue that doesn't have some sort of guard in front of it these days, are guarding against either right-wing militias or Islamic terrorism. They're not guarding against a progressive person coming down the street. I certainly take no exception to what she said. Obviously, an immediate threat of violence is far, far worse than an immediate threat of hurt feelings or distorted political discourse. Absolutely, far-right violence or Islamist terror is a more urgent danger than left-wing rhetoric. But there are other, longer-term considerations. I would argue that far-right or Islamist terror does not threaten to become mainstream in North American politics. All good people, by very definition, oppose that. When an incident like that at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh occurs, all the right people say all the right things. But when left-wing forms of anti-Semitism emerge in places like the UK Labour Party, in Canada's NDP and Green parties, in trade unions, liberal churches, and elsewhere, efforts to confront them are stymied by a wall of noise alleging silencing, smears, persecution complexes, and anything but the empathy or introspection with which progressive people self-aggrandizingly claim we respond to any allegation of bias against any people other than Jews. So yes, right-wing violence is a greater immediate threat to Jewish people than left-wing agitation. But which has the greater long-term danger to our social fabric, including the long-term safety and security of Jewish people? Unchecked prejudice seeping in to the very mainstream of our political discourse risks altering the DNA of our democracy in ways that perpetrators of political violence only wish they could. Returning to that Marxian measuring stick, remember, Marx did not view Jews as a national people, or even as a religion, so much as he viewed them as a political and economic class. And we fool ourselves if we believe that critique does not influence today's left. As a result, if we view Jews not as a disadvantaged minority, but as an economically advantaged class, anti-Semitism is not racism. Taken a step further, if we view Jews as rich, which is a prevalent stereotype, the act of bringing the Jews down a peg can be interpreted not as a hate crime at all, but as advancing economic equality. It's a crude idea, obviously. It's an outright racist economic critique. But I am absolutely certain that this is a core underpinning of anti-Semitism and unconscious bias about Jews that we see on the left. Carrying on down this rabbit hole, we spoke at the start about non-Jewish people arrogating the right to define anti-Semitism. We see something even more galling: non-Jewish people telling Jewish people that they are only a religious group, not a peoplehood, not a nation, not a race. Whatever validity there may be in some of the content of this discussion, the intent is pure malevolence. The purpose is clear. If Jews are not a race, they cannot be victims of racism. A little semantic jiggery-pokery, and hey presto, anti-Semites cannot be racists. This would be bad enough coming from anyone. To see it coming from self-defined, anti-racist, progressive people is gobsmacking. And it's why people like me, and probably a lot of you, who have devoted our lives to left-wing causes, feel rejected and revolted by many of those with whom we've been marching. The most upsetting part is that these are the people with whom generations of Jewish activists, trade unionists, equality campaigners, feminists, and social democrats built these movements together with non-Jewish allies. And now the attitude is solidarity, whatever. These were supposed to be the decent people. We're not shocked by far-right anti-Semites, but left-wingers, progressives, liberals, these were the ones who Jewish people assumed and hoped they could count on if things ever got bad over here. And if most leftists are not engaging in anti-Semitism, They are not engaged in fighting it either. It has been said that betrayal hurts most because it does not come from your enemies. In her 2021 book, People Love Dead Jews, Dara Horn worries that Holocaust education may be having the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of viewing anti-Semitic incidents as early warning signs that need to be confronted, we look at these crimes and shrug our shoulders and say essentially, well, it's not like it's the Holocaust or something. Opinion polls tell us that huge proportions of people in Europe and North America, especially young people, know little to nothing about the Holocaust. We also know that despite stunning statistics about anti-Semitic hate crimes, vast swaths of people either are unaware of these incidents or not at all concerned about them. Amid this miasma of ignorance, I think it's fair to say, if people know anything about anti-Semitism, the Holocaust is it. In short, anti-Semitism equals Holocaust. And if the Holocaust is the only thing people know about anti-Semitism, you can imagine the response when somebody delicately suggests that a person may be exhibiting attitudes that could be defined as anti-Semitic. So we have a fundamental communication breakdown. A basic problem we have in confronting anti-Semitism is that most people, even people of goodwill, anti-racist people, do not know what 21st century anti-Semitism looks like. This is partly because anti-Semitism is different, as we said, but it's also because this is all new to us. To say this is new must sound strange. Anti-Semitism has been called the oldest hatred. We've been discussing anti-Semitism for hundreds of years. But from 1945 until 2000, we increasingly did so as if anti-Semitism was a museum piece. We mostly assigned anti-Semitism to the discipline of history. It may be the world's oldest hatred, but we arrogantly thought that we, of all generations, had overcome it. But this denies yet another core tenet of anti-Semitism. It is cyclical. It's always been cyclical. Just when Jewish people throughout history have let their guard down, whether in 15th century Iberia, 1890s France, Weimar Germany, or the Middle East and North Africa after 1948, here it comes again. And so it was in the early 2000s. Suddenly, like night at the museum, the artifact came back to life. To a great extent, society has refused to believe this fact. To admit that anti-Semitism has gotten worse, not better, in our lifetimes offends our fundamental progressive values. It suggests the arc of the moral universe may not necessarily bend toward justice. This is a possibility many of us simply do not want to confront. It offends our pleasant worldview that things are getting better, that our activism and evolution have not been in vain. This era of what some people call the new anti-Semitism began around 2000. Personally, I would narrow it down precisely to September 28th, 2000, and we can discuss that more in the question and answer if you want. But that is a lot of time to have a discussion about anti-Semitism. 23 years. In the past 20 years, we have had unprecedented societal discussions about race and women's rights, but we haven't had that conversation about anti-Semitism. At a high level, at an elite level, we have begun this process. Political leaders in the West generally make the right noises, and that's critically important, of course, but it has not sparked a large grassroots movement or a societal reckoning. And going back to the IRA definition, and just for the sake of this argument, let's pretend it's a perfect definition and everyone agrees. It's adopted by city councils, provincial legislatures, national parliaments, some universities. But I don't think it has seeped down into the broader community. We do not see similar solidarity from ordinary people at a grassroots level the way we do with Black Lives Matter, Me Too, or Indigenous reconciliation. Any response to rising anti-Semitism has remained largely at the elite level of statements of solidarity from prime ministers, leading clergy, university presidents. And to put a fine point on it, throughout history, when Jews have found favor with the Duke, this has resulted in additional resentment from the peasants. We've been discussing race, women's equality, gay rights, however inadequately, for a few generations at a minimum. But we let our guard down on anti-Semitism. In North America and Western Europe, we thought we had it beat. Then, when it exploded early in this millennium, we spent the first few years in disbelief, certain that it was a manifestation of events half a world away. And we have spent the succeeding years arguing over its definition, whether it is as serious as Jewish people say, arguing over the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. In other words, doing everything but actively fighting it. So now what? As I said, this should not be your problem. But of course, it is your problem. The email you will receive in the next day or so includes links to a number of resources, including practical hands-on ideas. Most of these are things that Temple Shalom and other organizations you belong to are probably already doing. And in fact, I've excised a bit of the discussion out. That's stuff that you really know. I don't need to go over it, but there is actually a decent document from the Jewish Federations of North America that is one of the things that I'll share with you. But I want to focus on the larger narrative and how we can alter the course. But first, I will digress into three of what I think are the most important messages around applied strategy. First, don't jump to the wrong conclusion. There are at least two streams of anti-Semitism. There's ill will, that is, genuine hatred, scapegoating, bigotry, all of that. Then there is ignorance, in the most innocent sense of the term. When confronted with an incident, why not default first to the assumption of ignorance rather than leaping straight to ill will? Relatedly, if there's an individual in the community who expresses a problematic idea, consider calling in instead of calling out. Years ago, when I was working with Canadian Jewish Congress of blessed memory, David was on the board at the time, 4 students at Pearson College of the Pacific on Vancouver Island were involved in an anti-Semitic incident. The school contacted us. We arranged a week-long immersive program in Vancouver with anti-racism educators, a Muslim-Jewish dinner in a sukkah, and programs with the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. Among other extraordinary outcomes, these 4 kids, who were from different parts of the globe, developed an astonishing bond with Brania Sonnenschein, a Holocaust survivor and an amazing spirit who is sadly no longer with us. It was absolutely life-changing for everyone involved, including me, and those 4 kids went back to their countries with a commitment to fighting anti-Semitism. And that would never have happened if we had gone the route of punishment and calling out instead of calling in. More practically, be intellectually prepared. Have some language in mind. Wrong slide, sorry. Everyone has probably had this experience. When someone utters a racist or inappropriate comment, we can be so shocked we lose our bearings and later regret our ineffective response. This is basic verbal self-defense. It's something Upstanders is working on, and we will have resources available in the coming months. Now, to the larger issue. First, the biggest elephant in the room. If only so we can move on to the broader issue, we need to get a handle on the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism dichotomy, because this is derailing the entire discussion. We can't get around it, so we need to get through it. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism have a complex, symbiotic relationship, and to deny this is like denying gravity. But we need to be able to explain how it works. To a large extent in the prevailing narrative, neither Israelis nor Palestinians are viewed as actual people, but are avatars of our various prejudices and guilts about colonialism, rich versus poor, lighter-skinned people versus darker-skinned people, West versus East, privilege versus lack of privilege, and so much more. This is guaranteed to create a situation that bears limited resemblance to reality. Overlay that already problematic scenario with entrenched but often unconscious ideas about Jews, and you have a historical, geopolitical, and moral mess. To confront this, I have a few ideas to consider. First, I think Jewish people need to be more. I think Jewish people need to more effectively express how and why Israel is intrinsic to their identity, because most non-Jewish people do not understand the depth of that connection. And this allows people to overlook the fact that hyperbolic attacks on Israel, which are viewed by the perpetrator as fair political comment, are felt most by the Jews closest to them and harm the multicultural fabric right here in Canada. Now, I recognize that is incredibly difficult because everyone in this room has probably been involved in a conversation that went right off the rails when you tried to explain why Israel is important to you. And so I recognize how difficult that is. And I think that probably accounts partly for why a lot of Canadians don't understand the bond between Jewish Canadians and Israel. We need to equip potential allies with the skills and confidence to engage on these topics, because far too many people back down because they say, well, I just don't know enough. Let me assure you, I don't know enough is a phrase you will never hear from people on the other side. Many critics of Israel speak from a position of almost complete ignorance. This is because for them, this is not a matter of nuanced discussion, but one of black and white, right and wrong. It is, in effect, not a debate at all, but a crusade, in which Israelis are all bad and Palestinians are all good. Obviously, this is not always true. Of course, there are incredibly well-informed people, obviously, on both sides. But there is an overwhelming mass of people who default to an anti-Israel narrative based on remarkable level of ignorance. We need to reject the playing field. We need to make it clear that you cannot be pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. The only way we will ever have peace and coexistence is through a negotiated peace. The only way to make sure anyone gets anything is to make sure nobody gets everything. That is the definition of compromise. We are either pro both sides or we are anti both sides. This is not a moral buffet. We have allowed critics of Israel to convince people that to be pro-Palestinian means you need to be anti-Israel. We need to advocate a more balanced approach because it is the only route to mutual coexistence. But we do not have to lay down our rhetorical arms. When Hillary Clinton was attacked incessantly by Donald Trump in the 2016 election campaign, Michelle Obama famously said, "When they go low, we go high." Remember how that turned out? We need to recognize the level of the debate our opponents are engaged in. We have been engaged in Talmudic disputation in an era of memes and shouted slogans. There's an adage in politics, when you're explaining, you're losing. We need to get off the defensive. We need to call out the hypocrisy, condemn the immoral alliances between anti-Semites, anti-Zionists, as well as well-intentioned leftists with the world's most atrocious entities. Feminists allying with the most misogynistic entities on earth, progressives siding with the most regressive ideologies imaginable, peaceniks siding with terrorists, civil libertarians and free speechers advocating academic boycotts, LGBTQ+ people making common cause with those who would throw us from rooftops. Let's not pretend our side is perfect, but let's not let the other side get away with moral atrocities while wrapping themselves in the self-righteous garb of social justice and human dignity. And here, to me, is the simplest answer to the endless debate about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. When activists complain that we are attempting to silence them by accusing them of anti-Semitism, tell them, we could sidestep this entire discussion if people who call themselves pro-Palestinian would just be pro-Palestinian. If they raised funds for projects that help Palestinians, advocated for women's rights, gay rights, equal rights, and democracy in Palestine, if they did anything constructive at all for actual Palestinians, instead of just attacking Israel in the most bloodthirsty language imaginable, it would be harder for people to mistake pro-Palestinianism for anti-Semitism. Under the circumstances, can you see why someone might get the wrong idea? Maybe take half the effort you use opposing the definition of anti-Semitism and spend it thinking about the definition of pro-Palestinian. There's a lot more we could say about the intersection of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but I think you get my gist. Broadening out, we need to translate kishkas into kops. We might know in our guts that something is anti-Semitic, but the nature of unconscious bias is that the people who carry it don't know it. The cheat sheet you will get by email from the American Jewish Committee is one of the best tools that I have seen on the subject. You'll get it in an email. And Upstanders, as I said, is working on a major resource addressing this topic as well. We need to confront the narrowness of the term anti-Semitism and maybe find a more inclusive terminology that recognizes the diverse forms the problem takes. That's a whole discussion, but as unwieldy as it may be, we have a model for encompassing language in the ever-expanding acronym LGBTQ+++, etc., so it can be done. Above all, we need to attack the Teflon that protects anti-Semitism, the myth of Jewish power. As long as people consciously or unconsciously subscribe to ideas of Jewish power, there is no motivation whatsoever to fight anti-Semitism. It is as simple as that. Beyond this, we need to shine a light on victim blaming. We do not blame the victim in other instances of racism, sexism, and homophobia. Stop doing it to Jews. We need to tell people you do not have the right to define for Jewish people their experiences. You don't do that with any other people. Don't do it with Jews. We need to have zero tolerance not only for anti-Semitism and, of course, all forms of racism and bias, but we need to take this a step further. We need to be vigilant around all forms of conspiracy theories about vaccines, about flying saucers, about why the McRib keeps appearing and then disappearing, because you can be sure that no matter what the conspiracy theory is ostensibly about, it will eventually become about Jews. And it hurts me to say this. I'm afraid we need to play to people's self-interest. I've always hated that Niemöller poem, you know, the first they came for the communists, blah, blah, blah. For one thing, it doesn't even rhyme. But the message is, if you don't stand up for the Jews, eventually they'll come for someone you actually give a damn about. Is that the message we want to give the kids? Anyway, at the same time, I'm afraid that appeals to our better instincts aren't doing the trick. Part of our strategy, I regret to say, needs to be that if, for no better reason than self-preservation, everyone should take anti-Semitism seriously. But this does not go only for other minority communities. It applies to our liberal democracy itself. For the first time in living memory, we saw the foundations of American democracy tremble on January 6, 2021. It is not a coincidence that this challenge to fundamental democracy occurred parallel to unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism in the Western world. There is a direct parallel between these two phenomena and the concurrent rise of authoritarianism and anti-Semitism across Western Europe and closer to home. If we want to preserve our liberal democracy and contest the growing hatred that typifies our public discourse, it is simply not feasible to play whack-a-mole with the amount of anti-Semitic and other misinformation, disinformation, and hatred online. While we need to fight it directly, we also need to develop intellectual self-defense. That means teaching young people and older people better critical thinking and media literacy skills. At a time when we are arguably struggling to teach the basics, and we do not even have mandatory Holocaust education in British Columbia, this is probably a pipe dream, but our very democracy may depend on it. If we have a portion of our population who believe, consciously or unconsciously, that the Jews control the levers of power, as the perpetrator of the mass shooting Monday in Texas did, it is a short leap to believe that democracy is not worth defending. Finally, excuse me. Finally, that was the applause line. Anyway, we need to acknowledge that confronting anti-Semitism means simultaneously confronting the reality that all our social progress does not guarantee a trajectory of perpetual improvement. Sometimes we need to return and fight the battles we thought our grandparents had won. This offends our sense of justice, our vision of a civilization that is ever enlightening. But that offense against our sense of justice should be the moral force that drives us to stand up, not to hide in a make-believe world where the world is as we would like it to be, but to work in the real world to make it the place it should be. It sounds like a lot of work, and I'm afraid it will be, because we really have not even begun this discussion as a society. I've tried to condense a few millennia into less than an hour, so I hope you'll forgive me the shortcomings. I want to be clear, I am still formulating these ideas in case that wasn't obvious. The projects that Upstanders is working on are works in progress, and so I hope you will challenge me in the Q&A, because that will help in this process. But I thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation.
Pat, thanks for agreeing to take some questions. I have a mic. Put your hand up and I'll come around to you so we can all hear the questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Pat, for speaking to all of us. I really took to heart what you were saying. One question I have is, if you've ever heard of David Horowitz or Dr. Naomi Wolf, they are two former leftists who are now very conservative and pull apart leftism, in their own words, and dissect it to be, pro-conservative but pro-Israel and pro-defending the Jews.
Sorry, the second person was Dr.
Dr. Naomi Wolf.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Dr. Wolf, no. I thought you were referring to Inat Wilf, the former Labour MK, who is, if you haven't read her stuff, Inat Wilf, former Labour MK, brilliant. But anyway, sorry.
So my question is, why do you think there are so many more people from the left who go to the right to defend Israel and Jews in general?
Because we're all getting older? No. You know the old
Thank
joke.
you.
What is it? If you're not a socialist when you're 20, you have no heart. And anyway, why? Well, look, I mean, if you feel betrayed by your allies, I was working on a political campaign, and I had somebody who asked, I had said that, support for the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state is a red line for me in conversation. It wasn't in any formal setting. And the person said, so that's your litmus test? And I said, it's not a litmus test. It seemed dismissive to call it a litmus test. The point is, you don't keep marching with people who don't respect a people's right to self-determination. You don't, there's a lot of criticism of, going back a little in Canadian history here, but the social credit movement. Preston Manning's father, Ernest, there were overt anti-Semites in his party. He what's the word? Purged them. And this is something that we have not seen the left do. Now, again, the variable here is that the people will say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic at all. I'm anti-Zionist. And so then we're back in that whole scenario of arguing over nuance. And obviously there is validity in aspects of that discussion. There has to be. One of the problems is we say that there are strains of anti-Semitism in the anti-Zionist movement. The anti-Zionist movement says, you're saying that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. And we're saying, no, that's not what we're saying. And so we can't even have this conversation. But the ultimate question was, why are these former leftists leaving? Because they feel betrayed. Now, again, whether they become, whether they adopt a larger, more right-wing ideology, that's a different individual thing. I mean, we've seen that a lot throughout history. In fact, the neoconservatives who emerged in the 1960s and 70s, many of them prominent Jewish intellectuals, almost all of them came from the left, and then basically created this sort of new ideology of neoconservatism. But I think it's simply you can't just keep marching with people who hold terrible ideas.
Thank you. Pat, when you're talking to people who aren't Jewish, how will you or how do you explain to them the people on the left who are actually Jewish, who are protesting IRA, like here in the synagogue with those mayoral candidates, several of those people who stood up protesting said, I am a Jew. And definitely there's, like, I won't say his name, a rabbi who, with independent Jewish voices. How do you explain those people to people who are non-Jews?
Have you ever met a gay person who's opposed to equal marriage? There are people in any group. Okay, that was dismissive. There's a couple of variables here. Elie Wiesel said that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And it is interesting that the Jews who are anti-Zionist or highly critical of Israel, they are not indifferent, right? They care very much about Israel, whether that looks like the same way that we care about Israel or looks very, very different. They're not indifferent to it. And most of those people come to their positions about Israel through their personal interpretation of their Judaism. They will view their activism through a Jewish lens, and a lot of the Israeli and Jewish organizations that criticize Israeli policy do so through a Jewish lens, and that's fine. But what is really problematic is the tokenism that the left and that the anti-Israel movement employs in dealing with Jewish people. And they, in the worst instances, they will literally push the Jewish individual. There might be 100 activists there, but if one is Jewish, be sure that they're going to be pushed to the front. And this will be sort of put out there as, proof that they can't be anti-Semitic because here's a Jew. But also that that there are legitimate, obviously, there are legitimate positions that Jewish people, Jewish activists on the left have on this subject. But the manner in which they are I would say, exploited by the movement in many cases, is not something, again, that they would do, that progressive people would do with a member of any other group. You don't have an organization where they grab a member of a minority community and shove them to the front of the group to prove a point. There's something really distasteful about that. I'm not sure I answered your question, actually. Did... Yeah, well, okay, so, so when these young people, I don't know, they weren't all young, I guess, but when the people protested here a couple of months ago, when you stand up and you hold a sign that says anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, 25 years ago, when that phrase started showing up, it almost always had a caveat. It would say anti-Zionism is not necessarily anti-Semitism, or criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, and certainly no reasonable person says it is. But now, this has become a mantra. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And leaving aside whatever logical inconsistencies there are there, just think about a member of a progressive movement who calls themselves anti-racist being told by somebody, a member of a minority community, I think there might be an issue here. No issue. Not reflecting on that. No introspection. I'm not going there. I reject your allegation. There is no other group of people other than Jews that anti-racist progressive people would ever dare to do something like that with. They would never reject any sort of introspection. If somebody came to you and said, what you just did was misogynistic, or what you just did was racist, or what you just did was homophobic, they would never say, no, it wasn't, no. They would say, well, how? Explain. I'm sorry, did I, That's just how progressive anti-racism works, except with Jews. I don't think we did it, did we? Okay, we'll talk later.
Okay, along the same lines that Karen referred to, that was going to be part of my question, is how does the Jewish community handle the progressive Jewish left that seems to attack Israel at every stance, including some of the Jewish NGOs? And that, I think, gives credibility to the non-Jews to attack Israel even more.
Yeah, definitely it does. I mean, even consider Neturei Karta. I mean, they have, I'm guessing they have close to zero legitimacy within the Jewish community, but they will be pushed to the front of any protest, and people point to them and say, we have to be careful. There is a legitimate, obviously, there is a legitimate place for these discussions. And there are decent people making reasoned arguments that we may or may not agree with, but that are made in good faith. And I think that is the clincher there, is if these are made in good faith. Now, we all have red lines. I mean, if you do not believe in the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state, and again, here's just an example of how this can go off the rails. You will actually have conversations with people who say, no, I believe in Israel's right to have to be a Jewish state. I also believe in the right of return. It's like, the old line about wanting a strong and independent Quebec within a strong and unified Canada, whatever it was. It's like you don't have both sides, you don't get to play both sides of that coin. So I think goodwill is the thing that we have to use as the arbitrator there. Are these people engaging in goodwill? If they're Israeli organizations, I mean, like combatants for peace and so forth, who am I to argue with somebody who, was an IDF soldier in the West Bank? I'm not going to take that on. But I think you can tell fairly quickly in a one-on-one conversation with somebody if they're coming from a place of goodwill or they're not. And people coming from goodwill deserve to be debated, engaged with, and so forth. And then we know plenty of people, we encounter them frequently, who do not come from a place of goodwill. And the only thing we can do at that point is walk away. And one of the things, and I worked at Hillel for a number of years, and on the 3 main campuses in BC, and one of the things that we always try to remind students is there's this side, and there's like 2 or 3% of the student population who are emphatically on the other side, and there's like 95% in the middle who don't care, don't know, don't engage, don't have an opinion. And if that 95% sees us going at them like this, nobody is going to be convinced, and nobody is going to think that either of those people is reasonable. So I think the thing is, let's not waste our resources on the people whose minds we're never going to change, for one thing, and focus on people of goodwill. I mean, it sounds simplistic, but I think we do. And God, I've quit. It's almost a year to the day that I basically quit social media, with some exceptions. But there is where we on social media, we just waste 99% of our resources are wasted on people who will never change their mind. So what's the point,
Hi, Pat. First of all, thank you for your really informative presentation. My question is, you mentioned that anti-Semitism doesn't really have the kind of the grassroots support from non-Jews that other movements like Black Lives Matter or people that oppose anti-Asian racism have. And I just wanted to ask you, why do you think that is, that there's no kind of grassroots non-Jewish support for anti-Semitism?
On a theoretical, philosophical level, I think it is quite simply, this may sound simplistic, but I really believe that if you scratch the surface, a huge proportion of people have a fundamental, unconscious bias, some conscious actually, that Jews are powerful. If we devote ourselves to standing up for the underdog, and we subscribe to some prejudice that depicts Jews as the ultimate overdog, this powerful class of people, not a race, not a religion, but a class of people, which I really believe that is a fundamental component of the problem. Why would somebody stand up? There's a lot of causes in the world that need attention. If we believe Jews are powerful, why on earth would we choose that cause? And so that's why I believe that is a fundamental tentpole of anti-Semitism, and I just really think we need to hammer away at that and make clear that, and again, it's almost all unconscious bias. It's not that people are going around saying, I could tell you, you know what, I'll tell you a weird anecdote. I was shopping at the Safeway. How old am I? Shopping at the Safeway in Oak Ridge a couple of years ago, and it was right around Rosh Hashanah. And the cashier had his name tag, his official name tag, and then his name was written in Chinese and his name was written in Hebrew. And so when I got up to him, I said, Shana Tova, and he's like, what? And I said, well, isn't that Hebrew? He said, oh yeah, a friend of mine wrote that. And so this guy, really, really nice guy, he asked me, he assumed I was Jewish. I didn't say I wasn't. Whatever. He said, well, it's a 2-day holiday, isn't it? Blah, blah, blah. We talked a really nice interaction in multicultural Canada. This young guy wanted to talk about, another cultural holiday. And I picked up my bags, and I'm walking away, and he said, "Nice to have friends in high places." So, and this is a really nice guy who, I mean, I wasn't even wearing a tie, so these things are out there. And part of the problem, and you probably, I felt cringy at times saying some of the things I said tonight, and it must have been cringy to listen to some of them, because to address these things, you have to say what they are. And I think sometimes we're afraid to say what they are, and because they're unconscious, if we're going to make them conscious, we have to name them. And to name them is really awful. So if, these horrible ideas, the Jewish power and Jewish persecution complexes and things, right? But we have to name them in order to make people aware of them. But it's not a pleasant thing to do.
Hi, thank you, Pat. I just sometimes feel that we're bogged down as Jews. I feel sometimes the weight of thousands of years of hatred against Jews. I feel it viscerally. And then I take a look in the newspaper and I see what the United Nations says about Israel and constant barrage against Israel. Then I take a look at UNRWA, which is a UN agency devoted to the Palestinian people, which is now employs over 600,000 people. It's a huge industry, and they're there to keep themselves in work, and they're there to make sure that the Palestinians stay refugees.
Yeah.
And so all the original 800,000 refugee Palestinians now have all their children and their children's children, and this will go on forever and evermore. Thereby, Israel is the bad guy all over again. And sometimes I just feel like we're lost. You have Black Lives Matter. They don't even want to talk to you if you stand up for Israel. You go to universities, there's so many university professors who will just let you know straight out, you're a Zionist, don't want to talk to you. I don't know how you deal with that anymore. I really don't.
The journey of many miles begins with a single step. It's not uplifting. It is very, very overwhelming. I mentioned Dr. Annette Wilf earlier, and she co-wrote one of just an extraordinary book about the refugee problem. And here I'm not sure I'm offering anything that is in any way constructive here, but, well, the refugee problem was created and is maintained by the Arab people who the Western world has been led to believe are the friends of the Palestinians. And what we seem to, we've adopted, by which I mean Western society, European activists and North American activists have adopted such a simplistic idea that we will not delve down into the history of why things are the way they are, but we do precisely what the Arab dictators had hoped we would do when they created this problem in the first place, and that is blame Israel. It's worked brilliantly. And the fact that just this is one of those situations. Truth sounds like a conspiracy theory, and a conspiracy sounds like the truth. You try telling an average person who doesn't have much history, understanding of the history there, just how the refugee problem was created and why, and they just won't believe you. They just will not believe that people could pen up their own people in this way and exploit them for nothing but public relations purposes. it's, I mean, all we can do is keep hammering away at the truth and the basics of this history. But
But how do we do that if you have the United Nations constantly on Israel's back? How do you do that when you have the professors at universities so that Jewish students are feeling scared? How do you do that when you have UNRWA? How do you do that when you have Black Lives Matter saying, you know, and this goes on and on and on.
yeah. I mean, look, there's obviously, we have an alphabet soup of amazing organizations, primarily Jewish and Zionist organizations doing extraordinary work, but they are this tiny little voice in the wilderness. At the same time, that tiny little voice in the wilderness is dismissed as the Zionist lobby or the Jewish lobby. And so this little group of organizations and activists is depicted as this ginormous world-controlling entity. And so again, to some extent, it comes back to, cutting the legs out from underneath this fundamental tent pole of anti-Semitism, which is the idea of Jewish power. All of these things become more complicated because guess what? Israel is powerful, right? So here we are, we're trying to say, and what do? We just keep doing more. But I would say one thing, yes, there are Jewish students on campus who are afraid, but I will also tell you that when you read the newspaper and you get very depressed, but if you worked at Hillel and you went in there every day, you would have immense hope for the future, I'll tell you that. There's no simple answer. There is no simple answer. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about this 2,000 years later.
Well, I've heard about people saying, letters to the editor, why don't you cut funding to UNRWA? Why is Canada still putting in millions of dollars yearly to UNRWA, and UNRWA won't even take a look at the textbooks that are given out to these kids with hatred of Jews all over their textbooks? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is a fundamental systemic problem. Again, actually, I would recommend Dr. Wilf's book. I can't remember the title. Actually, I will include that in the email.
Matt, how are you holding up? You got questions?
I'm fine. I had extra coffee.
Okay. Hi. I would like to follow up what this lady was just talking about, UNRWA and influences on anti-Semitism and where it's coming from. I had discussions with my MP. I'm from Montreal, and Anthony Housefather is my MP, and I've known him for years and years, and I brought this up. I know as long as he is part of the Liberal caucus, he has to be very careful as to what he says without damaging his own position within the caucus and risk being thrown out. But he could be a tremendous asset, but he hasn't been able to convince other people that UNRWA is the problem that was just mentioned, but it is. But to follow this up even further, I learned something that blew my mind this past week when I attended a Zoom online lecture from the Middle East Forum from a think tank in Washington as to the undue influence on university campuses of having professors, highly, should we say, biased professors, totally anti-Semitic, are poisoning the minds of the youth. Now the question comes up, why do universities hire these people? And it goes into the fact that the universities are being funded by foreign governments to the extent where they just can't afford to not take this money, but the money comes with hitches. They must hire certain types of people who are anti-Semitic. How much money is being given? Millions? Try billions. Try as much as $500 billion. I don't know over what time period. That is going in where they're told to start providing studies, and Middle East studies, using certain professors who are known anti-Semites. And this is actually apparently in violation of some U.S. government rules. Money is going to the major universities like Harvard, Yale, and God knows how many others. And this think tank is trying to bring it up to the public and to Congress to examine their own rules, but they're allowing this to happen when it's actually illegal. That is, you can't use foreign money coming in that's going to influence policies. What can be done with that? How's that for my question?
Okay, so interestingly, some of the people here would have been 15 years ago, or shortly after Jimmy Carter came out with his book, Peace, Not Apartheid. The annual Federation campaign opening event featured, I wasn't expecting to be talking about this, so I can't remember his name, who came and explained there was an organization that dumped a ton of money on the Carter Center in Atlanta and bought Jimmy Carter, a man who is viewed as, you know, the epitome of decency in American politics. And by the way, Anthony and I went to McGill together at the same time, and I wouldn't put the continued existence of UNRWA on Anthony's shoulders. He, I'm sure, you know, I mean, it is a simple fact of our parliamentary system that a lot of the advocacy that takes place behind the scenes in caucus, and so we don't see what he's doing. But you know, for all we know, maybe things would be worse if he, you know. But I mean, UNRWA is a monstrous situation, and you know, Dr. Wilf's book again explains how it almost happened by accident. It almost happened by accident. It was just stasis. It was just one, not even bad decision. It was just like one, okay, let it go, because the Arab bloc insisted on this, and rather than fight with them, okay, we'll let them have this, but because we want this other thing, and it just spiraled and snowballed into this horrific situation. And this again is, you know, when we talk about, you know, if you don't want to be called, if you don't want us to question whether you're motivated by anti-Semitism, actually be pro-Palestinian. And people who are accepting the situation of UNRWA and the refugees and doing exactly what it is that the people who created this crisis to begin with wanted us to do, you're not being pro-Palestinian. I mean, you know, you can plow more money. I mean, we get these constant, you know, whenever there's a conflict, you know, we're told, oh, Palestinians aren't getting food. It's like, well, Palestinians receive more humanitarian aid per capita than any other people on earth, and they are among the most obese people on earth. But you will, I mean, we are fed these things, and people believe them. You know, these things, I mean, apartheid is one thing. You know what? I could call the ocean yellow or whatever. Like, I mean, you can call anything. And you know what? If you want to call Israel apartheid, okay, there's the West Bank, there's this, there's that. But genocide, what was it that Mahmoud Abbas said a couple of months ago? What has Israel perpetrated on Palestinians? 50 Holocausts. And people around the world go, You know, so, you know, I mean, I guess it comes back in some respects to just simple critical thinking. And, you know, God help us if we're back to, you know, having to go back to the basics of critical thinking, like rethinking our entire kindergarten to grade 12 through post-secondary education to teach people how to think. But, I mean, part of the problem is we are just bombarded now with so much information. We don't know what's true and what's not, especially on a subject that isn't our top priority. And so, you know, all our friends are going to the anti-Israel rally. We'll just go along. I don't know.
I have a pretty simple question, and that is, what led you, as a non-Jew, to speak and obviously feel so passionately and profoundly about this topic, about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, because that would, to some extent, give us an idea how we can encourage other non-Jews to follow your steps.
Okay, actually, there's not any great exciting story. At McGill, I took a couple of Jewish studies courses because they were interesting. Ruth Weiss was a professor there at the time. And then I came back to Vancouver. I did I fell into the Jewish community. I came back. I did journalism at Langara. A friend of mine said, a guy on my baseball team is the publisher of the Jewish Bulletin. You should meet him. And I'm like, why should I meet him? Anyway, she pushed me to go meet him. And then I was writing for them, and then I was proofreading, and then it was for sale, and we bought it. And one thing led to another. But I guess the short answer is, well, the moment that if there was no moment, but I was involved in left-wing movement. I've always been involved in left-wing movements, and starting in 2000, but it took a little while, in the early 2000s, I'm hearing, my friends on the left saying this stuff, and I'm going to Jewish community events and hearing people express genuine fear and anxiety about what's going on. But also, I had enough academic history of the conflict to understand that when the Oslo process collapsed and the Second Intifada began, okay, so nobody took up my bone when I threw out that September 28th, 2000 thing. Come on.
Question one.
Okay, so this is where the left went off the rails. The left went off the rails on September 28th, 2000. Let me preface this by saying that France did not erupt in an orgy of anti-Semitism because Alfred Dreyfus was accused of being a traitor. Alfred Dreyfus was the spark that set off a pre-existing anti-Semitism. What happened when the Palestinians overthrew, and here again, it's like, oh, now you're talking about now you're talking about Israel, and I'm talking about anti-Semitism, and this is where we get off the rails in this conversation. But the Palestinians overthrew the negotiating table and returned to violence in a way that was so completely irrational. They had been given and were on the road to receiving everything, there was really no compromise. They were receiving everything that they claimed that they wanted. Now, there's two factors here. One is that what they claimed, in English, to want wasn't what they actually wanted, because all through the Oslo process, Arafat had been saying in Arabic that he still planned to drive the Jews into the sea, while telling Bill Clinton, as Bill Clinton said, that they were willing to coexist in peace, while he continued to teach young people to blow up Jews wherever they see them. But that's irrelevant. Like, you don't curse the apple tree because it doesn't bear figs. Like, Arafat was a terrorist, and he always was a terrorist, and the only reason that he engaged in the Oslo process was to buy time after the Soviet Union collapsed and he had no allies anymore. So that's almost irrelevant. There shouldn't have been a surprise that he returned to violence, because violence is all he knew. And he even told Ceausescu that he had no intention of governing because he didn't know how to govern. What the problem was and is the reaction of the world. And now I say September 28th, of course nobody here knew what was happening at the time. Nobody certainly knew that it was going to turn into the Second Intifada. But the world looked at this situation. The world saw the Palestinians overturn the negotiating table, and progressive people, peaceniks, for whom a core value is that we never accept violence when there is even a remote possibility of a negotiated settlement, sided with the violence. And the only way that you can come to the conclusion, there's the two things. The Palestinians, they didn't want Oslo because what Oslo promised wasn't actually what they wanted. They wanted Israel, right? They didn't want Palestine, they wanted Palestine and Israel. Never mind that. What the world saw was that the Palestinians must have had a really good reason to overturn the negotiating table. And so we created, the world, the left, all the NGOs, UNRWA, everybody got together to create this mythology that the Oslo process all along had been bupkis, that it was never going to grant the Palestinians what they needed. And the only way that you can look at the history of that fact, and here again I warn you, I'm sorry for saying it this crudely, but ultimately, the only way you can accept that theory is if you believe that nobody has ever bested those people in a negotiation. There is a fundamental anti-Semitism at the heart of the entire Western world's response to the collapse of Oslo, and that is that the Palestinians never stood a chance at negotiations because look who they were up against. So all the facts, all the evidence that Israel was prepared to give the Palestinians everything that they demanded is thrown out the window, and the Palestinians, for their part, thought, well, you know, all we know is how to fight. Well, what they didn't count on, apparently, was that in the years since 1948, the Jews learned to fight too. And so now we've had 23 years of this, and the reason that, one of the reasons that we have got into this extraordinary hyperbolic anti-Israel stuff where the leader of the Palestinian Authority, who is the moderate Palestinian leader, can accuse Israel of 50 Holocausts, is because we had to invent to justify rejecting a negotiated settlement that would give everything that the Palestinian people told the Western world that they wanted, to reject that, we had to invent a mythology that none of that was ever going to manifest, and therefore we also had to paint the Israelis in a way that, since the facts will not speak for themselves, we had to invent phrases like apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, 50 Holocausts, because only hyperbole can justify overturning the negotiating table when, and reverting to violence.
Thank you. I want to just let you know I really appreciate the intellectual rigor and rhetoric that you've obviously put into your arguments. It's a very deep dive into analysis, which I find is very refreshing. And I actually have 3 questions for you. They don't need to be long responses, but I think they're targeted specifically to your presentation. You had said that we are not your target audience. And I'm just wondering how and what does Upstanders Canada do to engage that target audience today, and what are your plans for the future?
So, Upstanders is constantly morphing. One of the fundamental premises of Upstanders is that we want to engage people, especially people who live who are either in geographic or demographic communities that are not generally represented by the Jewish community. So basically, we especially want people outside Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, so that when, for example, I'll just give you an example of what our strategy is here. We know from people on the inside that when somebody like Sven Robinson or Libby Davies in the day, and now Nikki Ashton and the guy from Hamilton, Green, is it? When they make their anti-Israel things, and when they make their stand against Israel, a lot of their colleagues are rolling their eyes and saying, there they go again on their hobby horse. But their colleagues in caucus don't do anything about it because it doesn't impact them. And so what we want to do is we want to create a situation where we are able to go into our database and find all the folks who live in, I'm giving away the secrets here, identify all the folks who live in NDP ridings, or Liberal, or Conservative, or Green, whatever, and make sure that those people hear from people in their ridings. So even if there are no Jews living in their riding, so that those members of Parliament hear from people in their riding, that when that guy over there in your caucus goes off on his tangent about Israel, that's hurting you at home. So maybe you want to tell that guy to tone it down. And again, that goes to self-interest. So that's a core thing. And I use the member of Parliament example. Not a better, but a different example is, you know darn well that the United Church, which keeps pumping out these anti-Israel resolutions, 90% of the people who are sitting in the pews, insofar as people are still sitting in United Church pews, on Sunday mornings, have no idea what their church is doing. And so if we can find a few of those core folks who are the backbone of the United Church in Shaunavon, Saskatchewan, and they can speak so that it's not always, I mean, the Jewish community is always having to, well, defend itself by going to the United Church annual, whatever they call them, conclave or something. You know, why aren't there folks, I mean, there are folks in the United Church doing this, but why aren't there more? And so we want to bring these people out of the woodwork. And this, by the way, this was 9 years ago during the Gaza conflict in 2014. I wrote an article in the National Post, and I asked the editor to put my email, a burner email, on the bottom, because I wanted to see what kind of responses I got. And of course I got murderer. But I also got, and this is what really surprised me, about half of the responses I got were from people who came out of the blue to say that they agreed with me. And I realized, and I was still working at Hillel at the time, and I realized, you know, we're out there trying to fight with people who are never going to change their minds. And what we haven't done is gone out and picked the low-hanging fruit. Now, the low-hanging fruit is, you know, obviously evangelical Christians and political conservatives, and that's great, but that's not my community. And so this Upstanders fundamentally is aimed at reaching the communities, finding the needles in the haystack in the communities where these things are the most problematic, and then empowering individuals within those. And we've got some great stuff coming up. We've got some resources that we're working on that I referenced repeatedly tonight, and I'm really excited about it. And I don't want to count chickens before they're hatched, but we have connected with an expert in the field who is just about what was the Upstanders target market from Central Casting. And so we're engaging her, and there's going to be some great stuff coming out of that.
One of the points that you made that I thought was quite significant is that you said that most non-Jewish people don't recognize or understand why Israel is so important to Jewish identity. Now, a follow-up question I'd have for you would be this. As somebody who isn't Jewish, can you let us know what argument around that you would find the most compelling that we could use when talking to somebody who's not Jewish?
So, you know what? You know, one of the problems that we've had, that Zionists have had, is we are saying, you know, I can't remember, trying to think of the name of the guy, Mitchell Bard, I think it was. Anyway. Basically, he said, don't start with Abraham, right? It's like I said in my thing, like we are engaging in like Talmudic disputation in an era of barking slogans and online memes, right? We don't want to dumb it down. We don't want to degrade ourselves and the cause by dumbing this down. But we also need to understand the level, the playing field that we're on. One of the things, it kind of has to be, so where I was going with that was, here we are saying, well, you know, the United Nations passed the partition resolution and blah, 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 and this happened and that happened. And the other side is waving the keys, saying, this is the keys to my grandfather's farm, right? They're going for the heart, and we're going for the head. And that is, well, that's kind of a Jewish thing, isn't it, right? Like, there's also, I didn't have time to include that. I will include, do you know this quote from Jean-Paul Sartre about anti-Semites playing with language? I love this quote. I will share it in the thing. It's extraordinary. But basically, Sartre said, anti-Semites just love to abuse language and throw out things like 50 Holocausts because we, Jews and allies, take words seriously. You know, we respect language and truth and facts. And anti-Semites will poke and poke and poke, whether it's true or not, because the objective is not to win an argument, but to see you upset. And there is something really fundamentally, there is something fundamentally sadistic in the anti-Israel movement, that it is notorious for rubbing Jewish historical experiences in the faces of Jewish people. Just the fact of employing the word Holocaust and genocide, words that had to be invented to describe the Jewish historical experience in the 20th century, and they take these and they slap them across the faces of Jewish people. Sorry.
Well, what about employing the idea of Jews being the indigenous people of Israel? Because that combines the historical, intellectual rigor with this new, DEI and inclusiveness,
right,
which is like the power of the indigeneity argument.
Yeah, there's, it doesn't wash. They simply won't accept it. For some reason, we will accept an unceded land claim that's 200 years old, 300 years old, as well we should, but we won't accept one that's 2,000 years old. And I don't know what the statute of limitations is on land claims, but there's also a fundamental premise in the anti-Israel movement that Zionism is founded in the Bible, and progressives, by and large, are atheists and agnostics, and liberal Christians. And so anything that smacks of religion, they will just reject outright. So when if you say, this is the indigenous homeland of the Jewish people, they'll say, it's in the Bible, we don't buy that. Again, we can reason all we want. I think strategically, all we can do successfully is go back to the fact that I keep saying you cannot be pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. As long as we insist that this is a all or nothing game, there will never be, it's not up to us, but as long as it is accepted that this is an all or nothing game, nobody's ever going to get what they want. Now, obviously there are some Zionists who think the West Bank, Judea, Samaria should be part of Israel. There are some Palestinians who think that Israel should be part of Palestine. But I think there is a fundamental difference between a probably very small minority in a democracy advocating a particular idea and let's just say that the idea of a two-state solution is not the predominant perspective of the Palestinian people or their leaders, put mildly.
So, yeah, wonderful talk. Many things to follow up on. I'm a mainly retired left-leaning social worker, and
Is there another kind?
Well, I guess that's true. I think my profession just doesn't get anti-Semitism, and I'm not just saying it's only my profession, but I think it's probably acceptable for most people to be mildly anti-Semitic these days. I think that's just, I think it's okay. You can be anti-racist, but I think you can be mildly anti-Semitic and nobody's going to care. So when I'm on committees and they're anti-racist, I try to bring out the, let's deal with the anti-Semitism, and I push, and sometimes I get somewhere, but okay, so I wanted to share that. There's another book you probably should have up there called Jews Don't Count.
Oh, yeah.
By David Baddiel.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant.
Because he's a left-leaning comedian in England who feels that, we just don't recognize anti-Semitism when it's around.
No.
Oh, and the last thing is a question which you probably won't want to tackle tonight, but are we a race? Because, we get into big trouble with that one.
Okay. So actually, I'm writing something right now that I believe there's a whole bunch of variables here. There are people who carry anti-Semitic ideas and don't know they carry them, and then there are people who say, I don't like the fact that Jews are XYZ, which is fundamentally anti-Semitic, but they don't somehow believe that that is anti-Semitic because, going back to your last question, if Jews aren't a race, I can't be racist. So there's a big problem there. But there's something else going on. And that is, there is something, there is no way, there is no way for us to understand or prove somebody's motivation. You can say to me, you're misogynist, and I can say, no, I'm not, and you can say, yes, you are, and neither of us is any further ahead. You can't prove why I said what I said or why I believe what I believe. So there's only the preponderance of evidence to assume why people believe what they believe. But in the case of especially social workers, progressives, anti-racist people, I'm working on something right now that I'm working through, and there's no way to prove this. But I honestly feel there's something so visceral about the approach that a lot of progressive people have toward Jews and toward Israel that it clearly isn't rational. But I almost feel like, when you're on a diet and you decide on Saturday night that you're going to have a Twinkie or whatever, progressives are, we hate racism, we hate misogyny, we hate homophobia, but, every now and then I just want to lash out. And, there's always there's a stereotype of the upright clergyman who has a secret sexual life, or the right-wing congressman who gets caught in a very compromising situation in an airport men's room, which actually happened. there are these people who believe, and in their private life act quite differently. And there is something going on among a lot of progressive people, including people who self-define as anti-racist. And I can't help thinking that there's just something that it's like cheating on a diet. It's like, I am so upright all the time, I just need one little, I know, I know it's not, of course it sounds ridiculous, right? But there's nothing rational about this, and this is one of the problems here. We're looking, there's a great phrase, actually, it's, you cannot reason somebody out of an opinion that reason didn't get them into, or something like that. So trying to argue anti-Semitism, trying to reason somebody out of a fundamentally unreasonable position or prejudice is probably a losing battle, so again, maybe we need to spend more time going after people's hearts. And sorry, to come back to your question, I think it has to be individual. When you're talking about explaining to people, trying to make non-Jewish people understand the centrality of Israel to an individual Jewish person's identity, all you have to do is, not all you have to do, you have to actually make yourself vulnerable with people who are probably going to pick apart your argument. But, to explain, as Bill was talking before this event about his family, he had family on two sides, I guess, on the St. Louis. Well, you know what? Like, some of them didn't survive because Canada, closed the gates to the St. Louis, and so his family were murdered. And if you don't get that, the Holocaust didn't happen just because, wow, that was kind of a leap of logic there. But one of the things people don't understand about the centrality of Jewish national self-determination is that the Holocaust didn't happen just because of Germany, the Nazis, and Hitler. It happened because Canada and Australia and the United States and every place but the Dominican Republic, and that was too late, shut their gates to all the Jews. And it was the Evian Conference in 1938 that said, do with them what you will. And that is why Jewish self-determination, what people don't understand is that, and this is there's all these communication failures. Jewish people and people with a reasonable understanding of history came away from the Second World War with a fundamentally different idea of nationalism than other people. A lot of people looked at the Second World War and the First World War and blamed nationalism. Jewish people looked at the Holocaust and blamed Jewish statelessness. So just at the moment in history when the world was turning against nationalism, just, at least in theory, we're not breaking down our borders. In fact, we're building walls again up along them. But just at the time when nationalism went out of favor with, bien-pensant of the West, Israel becomes a country. And this fundamentally irks some people because the Jewish people are just creating a national state at the time that we've decided national states cause world wars. And they don't accept and they don't understand how statelessness caused the Holocaust as much as anything else. And so people need to be able to articulate that. But that's just one example. I mean, never mind the Holocaust. Never mind. After 1948, the Middle East and North Africa was almost as dangerous for Jews in the second half of the 20th century as Europe was in the first half. What was the difference? Israel. The entire Middle East and North Africa was ethnically cleansed of Jews, but there was one country that would take them in. a country that didn't exist in the first half of the 20th century. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of the Men's Club, and I speak, I think, on behalf of everybody here, that was one terrific evening. And just the number of questions that were asked, and terrific questions, and your responses made it well worth attending. And this event has been recorded, so it's on the Temple YouTube. If you have friends that think would benefit by listening to this, it will be there probably by the end of the week. Pat let you in a secret, and I think I need to clarify, is that everybody who registered for this event will receive an email from me or from the temple saying these are materials, background materials that Pat has assembled that will, if you want to read more, this is being sent to you for that purpose. We don't generally give out your emails for any purpose. You can, but he is not receiving it. It's the Men's Club is sending it to you, and you've shown an interest in this topic by registering.
However, please go to upstanderscanada.com and sign up for to get emails from us.
Good. And for a more meaningful thank you, we have some Israeli wine.
Israeli wine. Thank you.